A hand reaches through the half-open window of a Chevrolet Monte Carlo, parked at a Moscow gas station on an overcast October afternoon in 1978. Quick, deliberate, practiced. The movement carries the precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment countless times in their mind, calculating angles and timing with the methodical care of an engineer solving a complex equation. The American driver, a mid-level diplomat assigned to the embassy's administrative section, adjusts his rearview mirror and pulls away from the gas station, completely unaware that beneath his windshield wiper sits a folded note that will initiate the most valuable espionage operation of the Cold War. The paper is ordinary, the kind available at any Soviet stationery shop, but the words written on it represent a threshold crossed, a decision made from which there can be no return. Robert Fulton finds it 17 minutes later as he parks outside his apartment building in central Moscow. His fingers tremble slightly as he unfolds the creased paper, immediately recognizing that this is something beyond routine experience. White paper, folded twice with geometric precision, block letters in English written with the careful hand of someone accustomed to technical documentation. 8 words that transform routine surveillance detection into something else entirely. Something that will occupy the highest levels of American intelligence for years to come. I work at military radar facility. We must meet. No signature, no contact information, no explanation of motive or method. Just a stranger's handwriting declaring access to Soviet military secrets and requesting collaboration with an enemy intelligence service. The brevity is both amateur and profound, suggesting someone who understands the risk but lacks the training to mitigate it properly. Moscow in 1978 operates under perpetual surveillance, a city where the architecture of observation has been perfected into an oppressive art form. KGB teams follow every American diplomat from apartment to office to market, rotating shifts to maintain continuous coverage while avoiding detection themselves. Phones are tapped through antiquated but effective Soviet technology. Apartments are bugged with listening devices installed during construction or maintenance visits that provide cover for technical operations. Casual conversations with Soviet citizens trigger interrogations that can last hours or days, destroying careers and lives through guilt by association. The entire city functions as an observation platform where unauthorized contact between Americans and Russians carries consequences measured in years of imprisonment or worse, where the simple act of accepting a note can transform an ordinary day into the beginning of a nightmare that extends across continents and decades. Approaching a CIA officer at a gas station in broad daylight violates every principle of operational security, every lesson taught in intelligence tradecraft since the beginning of the Cold War. The act itself suggests either desperation so profound that caution becomes irrelevant, or provocation so sophisticated that it mimics desperation perfectly to lure Americans into compromising situations. Most likely provocation, given KGB's history of elaborate deception operations. The KGB had perfected the art of sending volunteers to identify CIA personnel, building comprehensive files on American intelligence officers through staged defections and fake recruitments that consumed agency resources while exposing operational methods. Fulton photographs the note with a concealed camera, the kind of miniaturized equipment that represents the cutting edge of 1970s surveillance technology. By the time he reaches the American embassy compound, the message has been transmitted to Langley through encrypted channels that will be analyzed by specialists searching for linguistic patterns, psychological indicators, technical knowledge that might authenticate or expose the volunteer. The machinery of espionage had been activated by an unknown hand, setting in motion processes that involve committees, analysts, legal reviews, and risk assessments that will consume months before any response is authorized. And somewhere in the city's sprawling defense industry, a man returns to work at a classified facility where radar systems are designed to track American aircraft and guide Soviet missiles, knowing he has crossed a threshold from which there is no return, knowing that every day forward is borrowed time purchased with betrayal. The agency calls volunteers like this walk-ins, a bureaucratic term that understates both the opportunity and the danger they represent. Unsolicited, unvetted, statistically more likely to be provocations than legitimate defectors seeking cooperation or asylum. Every American embassy in the communist bloc receives them monthly, sometimes weekly, during periods of heightened tension. Soviet citizens claiming access to classified information, offering cooperation in exchange for money or asylum, or simply the satisfaction of striking back at a system they have come to hate. Most are mentally unstable, suffering from delusions of importance or paranoid fantasies. Some are genuine dissidents with no intelligence value, possessing courage and moral conviction, but lacking access to anything the CIA doesn't already know through other sources. A significant percentage are KGB officers conducting elaborate operations designed to identify CIA personnel and map American intelligence networks through patient cultivation and eventual exposure. Moscow Station had learned this lesson repeatedly throughout the 1970s, each failure documented in classified after-action reports that detailed how sophisticated the KGB's deception capabilities had become. The KGB would send volunteers with compelling stories backed by authentic-seeming documents that had been carefully prepared to pass initial authentication tests. CIA officers, desperate for sources inside the impenetrable Soviet military and intelligence apparatus, would take the bait, establishing contact protocols and meeting schedules that required elaborate tradecraft and significant resource allocation. Then the volunteer would disappear without warning or explanation, and weeks later, Soviet newspapers would publish detailed exposés revealing American espionage activities complete with photographs, dates, locations, and transcripts of conversations. The volunteers had been surveillance bait all along, designed to identify CIA officers and document their operational methods for counterintelligence training and propaganda purposes. So, when Tolkachev's note arrived on that October afternoon, the default response was rejection. The note was photographed, analyzed for fingerprints and paper composition, and filed away with a classification that ensured it would be reviewed periodically but not acted upon without extraordinary justification. He tried again 3 weeks later, demonstrating the persistence that would eventually overcome the CIA's institutional skepticism. Different location, same method, slipping another note into an American diplomat's car during a moment when KGB surveillance appeared distracted by traffic. This time, the message contained additional details that suggested genuine access rather than fabricated knowledge. References to specific radar engineering challenges, mentions of aircraft designations, and project timelines that aligned with what American intelligence had gleaned from satellite imagery and signals intercepts. Technical terminology used correctly, the kind of language that separates genuine engineers from intelligence officers pretending to possess technical expertise. Moscow Station photographed the note and filed it alongside the first one. No response, no acknowledgement, no indication that the volunteers' increasingly desperate attempts were even reaching decision makers. Over 2 years, he made contact attempts through every method available to someone without professional training in espionage tradecraft. Notes left in cars, approaches made near the embassy during moments when crowds provided temporary concealment, messages left in conspicuous locations that Americans frequented, each time providing more specific information, more technical details, more proof that his access was genuine and his willingness to betray Soviet interests was absolute. Design bureau names that CIA analysts recognized from other intelligence sources. Project designations that matched satellite imagery of facilities under construction. Technical terminology that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of Soviet radar development programs. By 1980, the persistence had become impossible to ignore through standard bureaucratic procedures designed to filter out provocations. Either this was the most sophisticated KGB operation ever conducted, requiring years of patient preparation and extraordinary resources, or someone with legitimate access to classified Soviet military programs was risking everything to establish contact with American intelligence. The decision was made to test the volunteers' authenticity through carefully designed authentication procedures. Technical questions were prepared by specialists at Langley who understood Soviet radar development at the deepest levels. Questions whose answers could not be fabricated or guessed, but required genuine access to classified documentation. These questions were sent through dead drops, pre-positioned locations where messages could be left and retrieved without face-to-face contact that might expose CIA officers to KGB surveillance and arrest. The responses came back accurate, detailed, current, demonstrating knowledge that exceeded what satellite imagery and signals intercepts could provide. Specific technical specifications for radar systems under development. Performance parameters that explained why certain design choices had been made. Production timelines that revealed when new capabilities would become operational threats. Every answer checked out. Every detail aligned with what was known or suspected about Soviet radar programs. The volunteer wasn't KGB conducting an elaborate provocation. He was exactly what he claimed to be. Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev wasn't his cover name or alias created for operational security. It was his real identity, his actual name printed on security badges that granted access to facilities the CIA had spent decades and billions of dollars trying to penetrate through satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and failed attempts to recruit sources. Chief designer at the Scientific Research Institute of Aviation Equipment, known throughout Soviet military and intelligence circles by its abbreviated designation, Phasotron. The facility occupied a sprawling complex in northwestern Moscow, hidden behind concrete walls topped with guard towers and surrounded by security measures that included armed patrols, surveillance cameras, and multiple checkpoints where credentials were verified through manual inspection and electronic databases. Inside those walls, protected by layers of security that assumed hostile intelligence services would attempt penetration, Soviet engineers designed the radar systems that would define air combat for the next generation of military aviation. Look-down, shoot-down capabilities that would allow Soviet interceptors to track low-flying aircraft against ground clutter, eliminating the tactical advantage American pilots had exploited throughout the Cold War. Doppler guidance systems for air-to-air missiles that could engage targets at ranges and angles previously thought impossible. Fire control systems sophisticated enough to track multiple targets simultaneously while jamming enemy electronics and prioritizing threats based on speed, altitude, and radar cross-section. Tolkachev's security clearance granted him access to every classified program under development at Phasotron, a level of trust that reflected both his technical competence and his perceived ideological reliability. He reviewed technical specifications across departments, attending briefings where design challenges were discussed openly among cleared personnel who assumed their colleagues shared the same commitment to Soviet military supremacy. He attended briefings where engineers presented their work and debated solutions to problems that had consumed months or years of effort. He examined prototype components months before they reached testing facilities, understanding not just what Soviet systems could do, but why they were designed that way, what compromises had been made, What vulnerabilities existed because of engineering limitations or budget constraints? To American intelligence analysts studying satellite imagery and analyzing intercepted communications, he represented everything they had been trying to obtain through technical means that provided only fragmentary glimpses of Soviet capabilities. To the KGB's 7th Directorate, the organization responsible for surveillance of defense industry personnel through background checks and periodic security reviews, he appeared ideologically sound and personally unremarkable. His personnel file contained no warning indicators that might suggest disloyalty or vulnerability to foreign recruitment. To his colleagues at Phasotron, the engineers and technicians who worked alongside him, he was competent but not brilliant, diligent but not obsessive, social enough to avoid suspicion through isolation, but private enough to discourage the close friendships that might lead to unguarded conversations. What made Tolkachev invaluable wasn't just his access, though that was extraordinary by any measure. It was his timing. The fact that he began his cooperation at precisely the moment when Soviet radar development was entering its most critical phase. He was offering the CIA a 10-year technological advantage. Born in 1927 in Akhtubinsk, Kazakhstan, a railway town defined by transit and harsh landscapes, Adolf Tolkachev grew up in a country that devoured its own citizens with bureaucratic efficiency that transformed mass murder into administrative procedure. His father worked as a railway administrator, managing freight schedules across the vast distances of Soviet Central Asia. His mother taught primary school, instructing children in Russian and mathematics while carefully avoiding topics that might attract unwanted attention from local party officials. Stalin's Great Purge reached its apex when Tolkachev was 10 years old enough to understand that people were disappearing, but too young to comprehend the scale. Between 1936 and 1938, the NKVD arrested millions on charges of counter-revolutionary activity, espionage, sabotage, and other crimes whose definitions were deliberately vague. Neighbors disappeared overnight, arrested in pre-dawn, raids. Colleagues failed to appear at work, their desks emptied, and their names erased from records. Families learned not to ask questions about the absent because inquiry itself invited suspicion, because wondering about someone's fate suggested sympathy for enemies of the state. Tolkachev absorbed these lessons early, developing instincts that would later define his operational methodology. He watched his parents navigate the system through careful speech and deliberate invisibility. His mathematical aptitude became evident in secondary school. By 1945, as the war with Germany ended, he had enrolled at the Moscow Aviation Institute, one of the Soviet Union's premier aerospace engineering schools. He met Natasha Potemkina during his second year at the institute. She studied mathematics at Moscow State University, sharing his preference for precision and his instinct for emotional control. What bound them together more than attraction or intellectual compatibility was shared grief, the trauma of having witnessed what the Soviet system did to families it deemed threatening. Natasha's family had been destroyed by Stalin's purges in ways that left scars visible only to those who knew to look for them. Her uncle, a military officer with an exemplary service record, had been arrested in 1937 on fabricated charges and executed as a German spy. Her aunt disappeared into the Gulag system, transported to labor camps in Siberia, and never seen again. Her grandfather had been labeled a kulak during collectivization and deported to Kazakhstan, where he died of starvation. They married in 1951, a union formalized through paperwork filed with municipal authorities rather than celebrated with ceremony. No ceremony, just bureaucratic documentation. Their apartment was small, monitored through listening devices that everyone assumed existed, typical of housing provided to young professionals. To observers, they appeared as another young Soviet couple, building modest lives within approved parameters. But in private conversations conducted in whispers or written notes immediately destroyed after reading, they cultivated something the system could not detect because it could not imagine its existence in people so valuable to state interests. Rage. Not the explosive anger that leads to reckless action, but the cold calculation of those who wait decades for the perfect moment to strike. By the time Tolkachev joined Phasotron in the early 1960s, as Soviet aviation programs expanded, he had spent years perfecting the art of invisible descent. To supervisors conducting performance reviews and recommending security clearances, he appeared politically reliable, ideologically sound, personally boring. His work was excellent, demonstrating the technical competence that justified his access to classified programs. His behavior was unremarkable, avoiding both the isolation that might suggest alienation and the gregariousness that might lead to unguarded conversations. His loyalty was never questioned because every visible indicator suggested a man who had internalized Soviet values completely. But beneath that performance, invisible to security services that monitored behavior without understanding motivation, lived something the system never detected. A man whose loyalty was theater, whose competence was weapon, and whose patience was infinite. What distinguished Tolkachev from other spies wasn't courage, which implies emotional drive. Tolkachev operated without emotion, approaching espionage as an engineering problem requiring systematic solutions. His collection methodology developed over months of careful observation and experimentation, studying Phasotron's security protocols until he understood them as thoroughly as he understood the radar systems he designed. Phasotron's security was comprehensive but predictable, relying on procedures that assumed compliance rather than deception. He never removed original documents from the facility, understanding that document control systems tracked classified materials through sign-out procedures. Instead, he photographed them using miniature cameras provided by the CIA through dead drops. The Tropple camera system measured smaller than a cigarette pack, producing high-resolution images on specialized film. He kept the camera hidden in a hollowed book kept on his office shelf, retrieving it only when circumstances aligned perfectly. The photography took place during lunch periods when most colleagues left for the cafeteria or smoked in designated areas outside the building. Tolkachev remained at his desk, claiming preference for solitude and packed meals. This behavior was unremarkable because he had established the pattern years before beginning espionage activities. To observers, it was simply his habit. He would close his office door, spread documents across his desk as though reviewing them for legitimate work purposes, and photograph page after page with methodical efficiency. Each session lasted no more than 15 minutes, a duration short enough to avoid questions. Each session produced between 20 and 40 images. Each session left no physical evidence that photography had occurred. Document selection followed strategic logic rather than opportunistic grabbing. He targeted materials that would provide maximum intelligence value. Radar performance specifications for aircraft under development, documents that revealed what Soviet systems could detect and at what ranges, countermeasure vulnerabilities in Soviet systems, weaknesses that American electronic warfare specialists could exploit, production timelines that revealed when new capabilities would become operational, allowing American military planners to prepare responses before Soviet systems were deployed. He avoided documents whose absence would trigger security reviews. The technical quality of his photography was exceptional, a reflection of the same attention to detail he applied to his engineering work. No blurred images that would waste film, no missed pages that would leave gaps, no lighting problems that rendered text unreadable. He tested camera settings beforehand using unclassified materials, ensuring perfect focus and exposure before attempting operational photography. Beyond photography, he memorized technical specifications that couldn't be easily captured on film: radar frequencies, signal processing algorithms, materials used in antenna construction. Later, alone in his apartment during hours when he could reasonably claim to be sleeping, he would transcribe these memories onto paper using a code system the CIA had provided, creating reports that supplemented the photographed documents with context and analysis. His compartmentalization was absolute, maintained through discipline that never wavered despite years of stress. At work, he functioned as the same engineer he had always been, demonstrating no behavioral changes. His interactions with colleagues remained unchanged. His productivity stayed consistent. When the CIA offered payment, understanding that financial motivation was comprehensible to interrogators, he initially refused. His motivation wasn't financial, but vengeance, and money felt like corruption of purpose. But CIA officers insisted payment created operational security by providing plausible motivation if caught. He accepted. The money accumulated in accounts he would never access, converted eventually into funds for his wife and son's future, insurance against the execution he understood was inevitable. Over 5 years, demonstrating consistency that reflected both discipline and luck, he photographed thousands of pages of classified documentation. Radar designs for the MiG-29 and Su-27 fighter aircraft, specifications that revealed performance parameters, specifications for the R-77 air-to-air missiles guidance system, technical manuals for ground-based air defense networks, performance limitations of Soviet look-down, shoot-down capabilities, vulnerabilities in electronic warfare systems that NATO forces could exploit. Each document represented hours of risk. Each theft could have triggered the security review that exposed him. Each photograph brought him closer to discovery while simultaneously justifying the danger by inflicting damage on the system he blamed for decades of suffering. CIA analysts assigned to evaluate his intelligence consistently rated it among the highest quality they had ever received from human sources operating in the most hostile environments. The material was current, providing information about systems under active development. It was detailed, including technical specifications and engineering annotations. It was directly applicable to American weapons development and tactical planning. Within the CIA's Moscow station, Tolkachev received the designation Giti Anquish, reflecting his strategic value. The documents Tolkachev photographed weren't just classified, carrying security markings that indicated their sensitivity. They were predictive, revealing future capabilities rather than current deployments. Intelligence agencies distinguish between current intelligence and developmental intelligence. Current intelligence describes existing capabilities, systems already deployed, threats operational today. Developmental intelligence reveals future capabilities, systems under design, threats that will emerge years ahead. Tolkachev provided developmental intelligence at a scale unprecedented in Cold War espionage. The radar systems he documented were designed for aircraft that wouldn't enter service until the late 1980s and early 1990s, a decade ahead of their operational deployment. The MiG-29 and Su-27 fighter programs, Soviet responses to American F-15 and F-16 superiority, were still in prototype stages when he began photographing their avionics specifications. He delivered complete technical documentation on look-down, shoot-down radar capabilities that would allow Soviet interceptors to track low-flying aircraft against ground clutter, a capability American pilots had exploited for years to evade detection. The intelligence arrived with a 10-year lead time, an advantage that transformed American military planning. American engineers could design countermeasures before Soviet systems became operational. Electronic warfare specialists could develop jamming techniques targeting specific radar frequencies and signal processing algorithms. Tactical planners could identify vulnerabilities in Soviet air defense networks before those networks were deployed. The United States Air Force conducted internal assessments using methodologies that calculated research and development costs saved. The estimated savings exceeded $2 billion in avoided research expenditures. But this figure captured only quantifiable benefits. The money saved and resources redirected. Stealth aircraft development benefited directly from his intelligence in ways that shaped the entire program. Engineers designing the F-117 and B-2 programs knew exactly which radar frequencies Soviet systems used, what signal processing techniques they employed, and what cross-sectional profiles would minimize detection probability. Electronic warfare systems deployed on American fighters incorporated countermeasures designed specifically to defeat the radar modes Tolkachev had revealed. Pentagon analysts calculated that his intelligence contribution altered the strategic balance of air power. His impact exceeded the combined intelligence value of every other human source the CIA operated in Moscow during the 1980s. Moscow in the 1980s was the most hostile operating environment for Western intelligence services in the world. Every American diplomat was followed by rotating teams. Every phone conversation was recorded. Every meeting was observed. The KGB's 7th Directorate maintained blanket coverage over all Americans. CIA's Moscow station operated under constraints that no other agency location faced. Officers couldn't meet sources without triggering immediate KGB response unless they employed elaborate deception tradecraft. Dead drops were compromised regularly. Communications via phone or mail were intercepted automatically. Protecting Tolkachev demanded tradecraft that pushed operational creativity to its absolute limits. Face-to-face meetings were essential because he insisted on personal contact. Over 5 years, CIA conducted 21 meetings with him, each one representing a calculated gamble. The solution came through technology and misdirection. The Jack-in-the-Box system, developed specifically for Moscow operations, consisted of an inflatable dummy torso equipped with a spring-loaded mechanism that could be deployed in seconds. A CIA officer would drive through Moscow with KGB surveillance following. When the vehicle entered a tunnel or passed through a location with momentary visual obstruction, the officer would drop into the footwell while simultaneously triggering the dummy's deployment. The inflatable torso would pop up into the driver's position instantly. Surveillance teams, expecting continuity, saw what they anticipated seeing and continued following the car. Meanwhile, the real officer escaped on foot. Disguises supplemented the mechanical deception. CIA officers transformed themselves into apparent Soviet citizens through prosthetic applications that changed facial features, clothing purchased from Moscow shops, and practiced mannerisms. Vehicle maneuvers created additional opportunities. Drivers executed sudden turns at intersections, forcing surveillance cars to commit to following or risk losing the target. Meeting protocols minimized exposure time. Tolkachev would arrive at designated locations using public transportation. The actual meeting lasted no more than 10 minutes. Recognition signals confirmed identity. Materials transferred hands. Communication between meetings relied on signal systems. Chalk marks on designated walls indicated readiness to meet. Window arrangements in Tolkachev's apartment communicated status. Equipment provided included increasingly sophisticated camera systems disguised as cigarette lighters and pocket calculators. For 5 years, these techniques functioned without catastrophic failure. 21 meetings executed successfully. But perfect operations require perfect security across all participants. And security measures can't control what humans choose to sell. On June 13, 1985, Adolf Tolkachev left his apartment for a scheduled meeting. KGB surveillance teams were already in position, waiting with patience born from certainty. He walked to the nearest metro station, carrying a canvas bag containing technical documents photographed over the previous 3 weeks, radar modifications for the MiG-29's fire control system, performance specifications for new jamming-resistant frequencies. The surveillance was heavier than usual. Multiple vehicles, teams rotating positions. But Tolkachev had grown accustomed to KGB presence as ambient reality. He had no way of knowing that every step was being monitored with precision, indicating something beyond standard procedures. CIA officer Paul Stombaugh approached the designated meeting location using an evasion route rehearsed dozens of times. He had executed the Jack-in-the-Box deployment flawlessly, confident that the tradecraft had worked. As he rounded the final corner, KGB officers emerged from concealment in a coordinated movement. The arrest was immediate and professional. No dramatic confrontation, no chase. Tolkachev was seized on a Moscow street by plainclothes officers who identified themselves through credentials. The machinery of betrayal had functioned exactly as designed. Moscow Station initiated damage assessment protocols within hours. The investigation began with standard assumptions. Each hypothesis was tested and eliminated until only one explanation remained. Someone inside CIA had betrayed Tolkachev. The mole hunt would span nearly a decade, but the investigation revealed something immediate and devastating. 2 separate CIA officers had betrayed Tolkachev through independent actions. Aldrich Ames, a career CIA officer working in Soviet counterintelligence, had sold classified information to the KGB beginning in 1985. His position granted him access to files identifying every Soviet source. For $2.7 million paid over several years, he provided the KGB with a complete list of CIA agents, including Adolf Tolkachev and at least 9 other sources. Edward Lee Howard, a former CIA officer fired in 1983, had defected to the Soviet Union in September 1985. Before his defection, Howard possessed detailed knowledge of Moscow station operations, including the Jack-in-the-Box system. He provided this information to Soviet intelligence as insurance. 2 officers operating independently for different motivations arrived at identical results. Tolkachev would have been compromised by either betrayal alone. KGB conducted Tolkachev's interrogation according to protocols developed for high-value espionage cases. He was held at Lefortovo prison, the same facility that had processed political prisoners since Stalin's era. Interrogators extracted confessions through psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and family threats. His wife and son were threatened with prosecution unless he provided complete cooperation. He confessed. The trial took place in closed military court. Charges included high treason, espionage on behalf of a foreign power, and undermining state security. Defense counsel offered no meaningful challenge. The proceeding was theater designed to validate predetermined outcomes. Verdict: guilty on all charges. Sentence: death by firing squad. The execution occurred on September 24, 1986, 16 months after his arrest. Soviet protocol employed single gunshot to the back of the head. His body was disposed of without ceremony or marked grave. CIA learned of his death through intelligence channels. His case file was archived with classification levels that prevented disclosure for decades. Aldrich Ames continued working at CIA until his arrest in February 1994, nearly 9 years after betraying Tolkachev. FBI surveillance had identified him through financial analysis. He had purchased a house for $540,000 in cash despite earning approximately $60,000 annually. He pleaded guilty and received life imprisonment. Edward Lee Howard lived in Moscow until his death in 2002. He died from a fall at his dacha under circumstances Russian authorities ruled accidental. Both betrayers outlived their victim by decades. Between 1985 and 1986, The agency lost 10 Soviet sources in rapid succession. The investigation team assembled in 1986 focused initially on communication security. Ames emerged as a suspect through financial discrepancies. FBI surveillance began in 1993. Howard's betrayal became clear through different paths. By the time CIA identified him, he had already fled. When the CIA's Moscow sources collapsed in 1985, Allied intelligence services received a message delivered through silence. British MI6 reviewed every joint operation with CIA. NATO intelligence coordinating committees restricted information sharing. Soviet intelligence celebrated. KGB officers received promotions. CIA's international reputation suffered. The recognition spread that insider threats represented permanent vulnerability. Tolkachev's case became required study material. Five Eyes arrangements underwent review. The decision to recruit Tolkachev was made in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles from Moscow. CIA headquarters operated through committees that reviewed proposals. The language used was deliberately sanitized. Sources weren't people, but assets. Recruitment wasn't persuasion, but acquisition. Aldrich Ames occupied a position that granted him access to virtually everything. The compartmentalization failed because someone had to maintain overview. Financial oversight existed, but functioned inadequately. Polygraph examinations detected deception, but were dismissed. What protected Tolkachev's operation protected Ames equally. The machinery worked perfectly for both. The CIA's greatest Soviet sources shared one characteristic: they volunteered. Oleg Penkovsky volunteered in 1960, providing intelligence critical during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dmitry Polyakov volunteered in 1961 and operated for over 2 decades. Tolkachev's intelligence matched or exceeded both. Where Penkovsky provided intelligence about existing capabilities, Tolkachev delivered specifications for systems under development. His motivation distinguished him. Penkovsky sought recognition. Polyakov operated from ideology. Tolkachev's motivation was pure revenge. Each operation ended through American betrayal. The intelligence Tolkachev provided continued saving American lives after his execution. Military systems entered service throughout the late 1980s. F-15, F-16, and F-A-18 aircraft carried radar warning receivers programmed with Soviet signatures. During the 1991 Gulf War, American aircraft achieved dominance through exploitation of vulnerabilities Tolkachev had exposed. Iraqi forces operated Soviet-designed systems he had documented. His widow and son faced consequences beyond his execution. Soviet authorities confiscated assets. Inside CIA, Tolkachev received posthumous recognition. Moscow Station restructured entirely. The Jack-in-the-Box system was retired. What distinguished his legacy was what his betrayal revealed about permanent vulnerability. Phasotron still operates in Moscow. Different designers, different systems, occupying the same complex. New engineers work unaware of history. The institution survived, adapted, continued. The machinery of espionage continues operating. States spy because security requires understanding capabilities. People betray because motivation overcomes loyalty. The cycle persists because incentives remain constant. Tolkachev achieved what he intended. His intelligence damaged Soviet systems, contributed to superiority that accelerated the USSR's collapse, extracted revenge. He transformed grief into sabotage through precision and commitment. Survival was never his objective. Impact was the only metric. He died for revenge accomplished through patience. The system executed him with bureaucratic efficiency. But the damage persisted decades beyond his death, embedded in American weapons and tactics that remain classified. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this investigation into Cold War betrayal made you see espionage differently, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe, because we're exposing the operations that governments buried and the machinery of intelligence that operates in perpetual shadow. Hit the notification bell. The next compromised source is already being betrayed somewhere, waiting to be revealed.